There was a time when the land of Canaan was inhabited by feared peoples, many of whom were descended from giants, men of unusual stature, brutal strength, and impressive appearance. Although many of these giants had been defeated during the conquest of the land, a few survived and lived scattered among the Philistines, carrying in their eyes the hatred of ancient times. Among these remnants grew up Ishbi-Benob. His name hardly appears in the stories told around the campfires. There are no songs about him, nor psalms that mention him, but his silent and menacing presence was known among the warriors. Ishbi was not just a descendant of giants, he was a trained warrior, armed with a huge bronze spear and protected by armor that impressed even the bravest soldiers of Israel. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. The Philistines saw him as an asset, an heir to ancient legends, a possible instrument of revenge against the king who, decades earlier, had killed the most famous of their own, Goliath, and the shadow of Goliath still loomed over the plains, fueling Ishbi-Benobe's insatiable thirst for revenge. Meanwhile, in Israel, David was growing old. The young shepherd who had faced giants had become king. His name was respected, his victories celebrated, but time had passed. The battles continued, but the king's body was no longer the same. The throne, though glorious, carried the weight of wars, losses, and difficult decisions. The armies of Israel marched again against the Philistines. It was yet another campaign, another conflict between peoples who had never stopped fighting each other. David, even in his old age, had decided to go to war alongside his men. And on the other side, among the Philistines, Ishbi-Benob waited, silent, determined. For him, this was not just another battle. It was the moment he had been waiting for years. At that time, no one imagined what was about to happen, an encounter between the weary king and the forgotten giant. A battle that would almost change the course of Israel's history. Before continuing, I want to invite you to comment on which city or country you are watching from. Let's see how far this message is reaching. David was no longer the impetuous young man who had run through the fields of Bethlehem, nor the fearless warrior who had faced Goliath with a sling and 5 stones. He now bore on his body the marks of years of battles, sleepless nights, and decisions as heavy as the throne he occupied. Although his spirit was still fervent, time had begun to take its toll. Even so, David insisted on fighting alongside his men. For him, leadership was not a distant command, but a constant presence. He believed he should be with the army, smelling the field, hearing the clamor of war, sharing the risk. That battle against the Philistines, for many, would be just one of many. But for David, each battle was still personal. The battlefield stretched out before them, dry, dusty, with the sound of swords clashing in the distance. The king put on his armor, drew his sword, and walked to the front line. The weight of the armor was different now. His steps were slower, his breath was shorter, but his courage, that remained unshaken. As his soldiers scattered, David remained focused. His eyes sought not only enemies, but memories. Each blow he struck was like a vivid reminder of times past, of lost friends, of prayers said in silence. He no longer had the strength he once had, but he still had the heart of a warrior king. In the midst of battle, his energy began to fail. The arm that had so often risen with strength now trembled. Sweat ran down his face, mixed with the dust of war. And it was in this state of exhaustion, a rare, almost imperceptible moment, that David found himself vulnerable. It was as if, for an instant, the flame of leadership was flickering, a flash of weakness that only attentive eyes would notice. And among the eyes watching him were those of Ishbi-Benob. He saw it, and he advanced. If this content is touching your heart, you can support this project by donating any amount by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. Your support helps me to continue telling these stories with dedication. From the middle of the Philistine army, between shields and spears, Ishbi-Benob advanced. His steady steps made the ground shake. The soldiers around him instinctively moved away, as if giving way to danger. His eyes, dark and determined, were fixed on a single target, the king of Israel. Ishbi-Benob was not only strong, he was driven by an ancient intention. He did not just want victory, he wanted revenge. In his mind, the image of Goliath, fallen to the ground, still burned like an unhealed wound. The death of the giant at the hands of a young shepherd was an insult that he carried as his mission. And now, decades later, the young man had become a weary king, vulnerable, within reach. In his hands he wielded a huge, heavy spear made of bronze and blood. It had been forged to kill. Some said it was a weapon made especially for that day. Ishbi believed that his destiny was to end the cycle started by David. If Goliath had fallen, now it would be the king who would fall, and it would be at the hands of another giant. As he approached, the battle seemed to fall silent around him. The sound of swords clashing became distant. It was as if the entire battlefield was waiting for what was to come. An encounter between the past and the present, between strength and fragility, between pride and purpose. David, exhausted, tried to stand firm. His senses were confused, his body heavy, but his spirit still rose. Still, he did not see the giant approaching quickly. Not in time. Ishbi-Benob raised his spear, ready to deliver the blow that would change everything. One single, accurate movement, and Israel would lose its king. A moment that seemed eternal. It was the moment he had waited for his entire life, and he was about to achieve it. At that point in history, it seemed that the end was near. The light of Israel flickered, about to be extinguished by the darkness that came with the giant. Ishbi-Benobe's spear cut through the air with a low whistle, a sound that heralded death. The giant advanced with fury, driven by years of accumulated hatred. His eyes showed no hesitation. He was about to fulfill what he believed to be his destiny, to kill the king of Israel. David, tired and unarmed by time, barely had time to react. His movements, once agile and firm, were now slow and heavy. His arms tried to raise his sword, but his body no longer responded as it once had. The legendary warrior stood before an enemy who surpassed him in strength and vigor. And this time, he was at a disadvantage. The clash between the two was not like the heroic duels of the Psalms and songs. It was uneven. David tried to defend himself, but the weight of the spear pushed him back. The sound of the impact echoed like muffled thunder on the battlefield. The king staggered, gasping for breath, his feet sinking into the dry earth. Ishbi-Benob did not stop. He raised his weapon once more, ready to end the fight. The moment seemed sealed. Everything indicated that this would be David's last battle, one final blow, and the light of Israel would be extinguished forever. The battlefield, until then noisy, seemed trapped in a terrifying silence. It was as if even the angels had held their breath for a moment. David fell to his knees. His gaze, still steady, sought strength where there was almost none left. His heart was racing, but his body could not keep up. For the first time since he had taken the crown, he was on the verge of death, not by an entire army, but by a single man. A giant, a name that almost no one knew, but one that could have ended the story of one of Israel's greatest kings. It was David's most fragile moment, an instant where everything seemed lost. One more blow, and history would have taken a different course. But when everything seemed sealed, something unexpected happened. Among the warriors fighting in the ranks of Israel, there was a man who was attentive, brave, and fiercely loyal to his king. Abishai, son of Zeruiah. Brother of Joab, he was known among David's mighty men, feared by his enemies and respected by his companions. His gaze never left David in the crowd, like one who guards a treasure in the midst of chaos. And at that crucial moment, when the king, fallen and powerless, was about to be struck down, Abishai saw. He saw the spear raised. He saw the giant about to deliver the final blow, and he did not hesitate. His body launched itself across the battlefield like lightning cutting through a storm. Dust rose beneath his feet. The swords around him seemed distant. For him, there was only one mission: to save David. With a cry that tore through the air, Abishai interposed himself between the giant and the king. His steady arm held the sword with the fury of one who protects something sacred. And without giving the enemy time, he struck a decisive blow against Ishbi-Benob. The blade cut through the space between them with precision, striking the giant with surprising force. Ishbi-Benob staggered. For the first time, his eyes showed surprise. He did not expect to be stopped. But there was Abishai, an ordinary man, but driven by unusual loyalty and courage. With one more blow, he ended the threat. The giant fell, struck down not by his own glory, but by faithfulness. David, still kneeling, looked up. He saw his soldier before him, sweating, panting, with the enemy's blood on his sword. For a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Nothing needed to be said. The truth was there. The king had been saved by the hands of a friend. On that field, amid the dust of war and the echoes of death, a gesture was born that would echo forever. The loyalty that saves, the courage that protects, the honor of a servant who became a shield. David would live longer, but he would never be the same again. This would change everything, not only the course of the war, but the king's place in future battles. When the dust of battle finally settled and the bodies were collected, the field fell silent. Tired, wounded, and battle-scarred soldiers gathered around David, but on that day, their gazes were different. It was no longer the warrior king who inspired confidence through his victories. It was the man who had narrowly escaped defeat. The scene of David kneeling before Ishbi-Benob remained vivid in the memory of the brave men. It was a profound shock, as if they had felt for a brief moment what it would be like to lose the king who had led them for so many years. A sense of urgency and protection spread among the men closest to him. So right there, in front of David himself, they made a decision. It was not a suggestion. It was a commitment. They swore that the king would no longer go to the battlefield. One of them said in a firm voice, "You shall not extinguish the lamp of Israel." It was a phrase laden with meaning. David was not just a man. He was the light that God had kindled to guide the people. And such a precious light could not be exposed again to the risk of enemy swords. The time had come to protect the one who had protected so much. David listened in silence. He did not protest. His tired eyes gazed at the faces of his warriors, now stronger than he was. He knew that time had passed. He knew that his mission was no longer on the front lines, but in the rear, guiding, advising, preserving. Accepting this was not easy. The king's heart still beat like that of a warrior. But he understood. He recognized that leadership now required a different kind of strength, the strength to yield, to trust, to let others wield the sword for him. From that day on, David never returned to the battlefield. The war would continue, yes, but with other arms, with other swords. The king remained as a guide, as a reference, but far from direct confrontation. And so, between the pain of farewell and the relief of preservation, a new phase in the king's life began. The flame remained lit, but now surrounded by the hands of those who swore to protect it with their own lives. Even with David away from the battles, the war against the Philistines continued. The enemy had not yet been completely defeated, and among their ranks hid other descendants of giants, men of enormous stature, armed with heavy swords and hardened hearts. They seemed to have come out of ancient legends, figures who, for generations, had terrorized God's people. But what had once caused fear now met with resistance. The men who followed David had been forged in years of battle and faithfulness. Inspired by the king's courage and strengthened by their faith in the God of Israel, they did not retreat before the giants. On the contrary, they advanced. One by one, the descendants of the giants were confronted and slain. Sibbecai, Elhanan, Jonathan, lesser-known names, but ones that shone brightly in this chapter of history. Each of them faced one of the sons of the giants and defeated them with bravery. The battles did not have the glamour of great wars, but they ended threats that had existed since ancient times. These confrontations were not only physical. There was something spiritual in each victory. It was as if Israel was ending a cycle of oppression, of fear, of giants who represented not only physical strength, but also pride, violence, and affront to the living God. The stories spread. The people listened with amazement and gratitude, as even without David on the field, the giants were falling. It was confirmation that Israel's strength did not come from one man, however brave he might be, but from the Lord who fought for them. With each fall, with each sword thrust into a giant's chest, something was restored in Israel. Confidence. The certainty that the oldest enemies could be defeated, that the shadows of the past were not eternal, that the threats that seemed invincible did indeed have an end. Thus the days of the giants came to an end, not by chance, not by luck, but by God's faithfulness and the courage of those who believed. The land that was once marked by fear was now witness to liberation. Ishbi-Benob fell in silence. No song was composed about him. No celebration was held after his death. There was no honor in his name, no lament for his fall. But even so, he left deep marks, not on monuments, but on the heart of a king and the structure of a nation. His legacy was not one of victories, but of remembrance. He was the enemy who exposed a truth that many avoided facing. Even the strongest have limits. Even the most anointed, the most experienced, the most revered, one day become fragile. And it was precisely through Ishbi-Benob that this reality became visible. The appearance of that giant almost extinguished the light of Israel. But his defeat awakened something even greater: unity around the king, protection, care, the realization that David's greatness no longer depended on his sword, but on his wisdom, his legacy, his living history in the hearts of the people. Ishbi-Benob, without knowing it, was a game changer. His attack brought a pause, a redirection, a recognition of the need for transition. David no longer needed to prove his courage. It was already engraved in the stones of history. But now he needed to be preserved so that his light could continue to guide Israel with discernment. That anonymous enemy brought to light something that even David's Psalms had not revealed so clearly: the importance of being cared for, the humility to recognize that time passes, that strength changes form, that to lead is also to know when to stop. Even though he was defeated, Ishbi-Benob had an unexpected impact. He revealed the strength of Abishai, highlighted the loyalty of the mighty men, and marked the beginning of a new phase in David's reign, a phase of transition, of protection, of new structure. There are no statues or lengthy records about Ishbi-Benob, but his brief appearance was like a wound that turns into a scar, discreet but unforgettable, a warning, a memory, a milestone. The giant that no one talks about was, in fact, the instrument God used to teach the king and the people that even the great need to be guarded. After that day, something changed within David. He was no longer just the invincible warrior, the giant slayer, the hero of battles sung about in public squares. Now he was also a man who had been saved, a king who needed to be supported. And this, far from diminishing his honor, made him even more worthy of respect. David never tried to hide his fragility. He was king, but he had always been transparent before God and his people. He cried, he feared, he confessed. His psalms revealed an open human heart, full of ups and downs. And in that episode with Ishbi-Benob, the people saw with their own eyes what his psalms had already told them in words. The king also needed to be protected. It was a silent but profound lesson. David understood that his leadership was no longer in the hands that wielded the sword, but in the eyes that saw beyond the battle. His role now was to guide with wisdom, instruct with experience, and prepare the way for those who would come after him. Maturity led him to value the men around him even more. His brave men were no longer just soldiers, but became guardians of the promise. They surrounded him, not only as subjects, but as brothers who understood the weight David carried. And it was at this stage that David began to prepare his successor. He understood that his mission was not eternal, that the throne needed to be passed on responsibly, and that the wisdom inherited in battle should now be shared in advice, instruction, and prayer. The experience with Ishbi-Benob served as a bridge, a moment when the king learned that his greatest strength lay in recognizing his limitations and trusting those God had placed at his side. It was no longer time to fight with his own hands. It was time to train, delegate, and trust. And so, the one who had inspired a generation of warriors went on to inspire a generation of leaders as well. His vulnerability became a legacy, his weakness a testimony, and his humility a lesson that would echo for centuries. David would continue to reign, but now with the awareness that even kings need shelter, and that true greatness is not in never falling, but in knowing how to be lifted up. The story of Ishbi-Benob may go unnoticed by many readers of the Bible. His name is mentioned only once, his appearance is brief, and his end is quick. But behind this short narrative lies one of the most significant lessons about leadership, humanity, and fellowship. David, the warrior king, the slayer of Goliath, was almost killed by an unknown giant. A moment that seemed insignificant became a turning point, not only for him, but for his entire kingdom. The king's fragility revealed the value of mutual protection. It showed that even great leaders, the most experienced ones, also face moments of weakness, and that in those moments, they don't have to face them alone. Abishai, by intervening, teaches us about loyalty. He was not motivated by ambition or a desire for glory. He was motivated by care. His sword was raised to preserve a life, and that speaks deeply to the call to be guardians of one another. We also learn that there is a time for everything. David understood that his warrior phase had passed. The king who wielded swords now wielded wisdom. There is wisdom in recognizing one's own limits, in accepting help, in letting others take on roles that were once ours. Humility and maturity go hand in hand. This story teaches us, with depth and truth, that no one walks alone through this life. No matter how strong, experienced, or anointed someone may be, there will always be moments of fatigue, vulnerability, and even unexpected threats that surprise us in the middle of the journey. We were not created for self-sufficiency, but for fellowship. That is why we need each other. We need sincere relationships built on trust and faithfulness, friendships that not only walk with us on good days, but that stand up for us when we can no longer stand on our own. To value these people is to recognize that they are gifts from God, living protection sent to us when we need it most. Recognizing our limits, in turn, is not a sign of weakness, but of wisdom. There is dignity in admitting that we cannot do everything. Likewise, we must be attentive to those around us, ready to intervene, help, and protect. Sometimes, a gesture on our part can be the difference between someone falling and being preserved. And there is an even more subtle, but no less powerful lesson, knowing when it is time to stop. There is a type of silent leadership that reveals itself precisely when someone chooses to step back, pass the baton, and preserve themselves in order to continue guiding in another way. Finally, we also learn that seemingly small moments, brief encounters, battles that seem routine, gestures that seem simple, can have eternal impacts. God acts even in the details, and it is there often that he teaches us the greatest truths. If you enjoyed the story of Ishbi-Benob and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.